I am once again really pleased to be joined by a group of sibling sexual abuse survivors. And on our 2023 Awareness Day, a number of these great, amazing faces were here as well. And we have some new faces joining us this year. So I'm just going to take a moment and ask everyone to please quickly introduce yourself, tell us where you hail from, and give us a little bit of information about yourself. I will be going around the room to the people that I can see. So Phil, it's over to you.
Hi, I'm Phil Goldstein. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I am a sibling sexual abuse survivor, and I'm also the author of the poetry book, How to Bury a Boy at Sea, which reckons with the trauma of CSA, SSA.
Welcome, Phil. Bryn, up
Hi.
over to you.
All right. I am Bryn Langdale. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist in California, and I am also a sibling sexual abuse survivor and working on publishing a memoir talking about my experience as a child, healing, and forgiveness.
Welcome. Ignacio.
Hi, my name is Ignacio Rivera. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the founder and co-executive director of the HEAL Project. I'm also a survivor, and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Thank you for that. Jane.
Hello, my name is Jane Epstein. I am in Northern California, and I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being on this call, and thank you, Nancy, for doing this for the second year in a row. I firmly believe in awareness. I am a TEDx speaker. My TEDx title is Giving Voice to Sibling Sexual Abuse, and I have a memoir coming out in the fall. I'm a co-founder of 5 Waves.
Great to have you here again, Jane. Good to see you. Gloria.
Hello, everyone. My name's Gloria Masters. I'm from New Zealand, so I'm a day ahead. My role is I'm an author, I'm a survivor, and I'm a founder of the podcast channel called Handing the Shame Back and the foundation of the same name. I'm very grateful to have published my third book, Keeping Kids Safe, which alerts and informs parents, teachers, and others on what to look out for and how to protect kids.
That's great. Thank you for that, Gloria. And Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria Sokoloff. I am on Long Island, New York, and I'm also co-founder with Jane of 5 Waves, a nonprofit that focuses on sibling sexual trauma and abuse. And I'm the author of my memoir, The Invisible Key: Unlocking the Mystery of My Chronic Pain, which talks about the link between my pain and my sibling sexual trauma.
That's great. Thank you for being here. And I am Nancy Morris. I'm the founder of the SiblingsToo project, the SiblingsToo podcast, and the producer of the annual International SiblingsToo Day. So once again, everyone, welcome. Let's jump into the conversation today. So there's all sorts of different places we could start, but where I really want to start right now is looking at the relationship, the sibling relationship within a family. And this is something that I think many people dismiss or don't think of. They don't consciously dismiss it, but they don't necessarily think of it. The sibling relationship is considered the longest and most enduring in our life. And therefore, when there is either a trauma or a level of abuse between two siblings and or an impact on other siblings in the family, it really can change the dynamics for everyone. So let's just share some of our experience and some of our thoughts on that. Gloria, how about we start with you in terms of the sibling relationship, the importance of the sibling relationship over the lifespan, and how something like sibling sexual trauma can impact relationships between siblings?
Yes, great question. I think speaking from many years of being abused by my brother, who was 4.5 years older than me, the trust was so deeply broken that it meant any other relationship that I went into was marred by that or informed by that. Being the first relationship I had, and therefore a deeply held one, to have been betrayed and trust broken by someone who had often been tasked to look after and protect me was in and of itself not just confusing but deeply traumatic. And I think you coined it at the beginning when you said, because the sibling relationship is usually the longest we will ever have, to me, the level of betrayal and impact mirrors that. So that's, I think, key.
That's great. So for others on the call, you've all had, you know, some impact related to your relationships with others in the family, and particularly siblings. Does anybody else want to speak to how SSA has impacted you, Maria?
Yeah, I'd like to say that for me, my event was a one-time thing. My brother molested me once, and still that deep trauma, I think, really comes from that betrayal. That it's my brother, just what Gloria said. It's such a deep betrayal, and my trauma is equivalent to people I know who had years and years of horrific abuse. So I think that that relationship means so much going into it. It was my older trusted brother, and when that was broken, and how he violated me was enough to, you know, set me on a path of dealing with my trauma for now 40 plus years since.
Sure, and I think you bring up a really good point there, in that we know that there are a variety of behaviors that are considered to be part of sibling sexual abuse, and you know, they sort of all have different aspects to them, and this is where society makes a mistake, and they, you know, I know when I disclosed to an adult years and years ago, I disclosed to an adult and I heard boys will be boys, you know, that is really demonstrates a real misunderstanding. Now that was a family member, but it would also be the same sort of response I would get from the community. I would get that response from society, which shows that they don't understand those behaviors, but they also don't understand the impacts of any level of sibling sexual abuse creates a trauma which can impact your entire life. And in your case, Maria, for example, it became a thing that your body held, and then you ended up with chronic pain. So Ignacio, I saw your hand.
Yes, I mean, I think all of us can say that it completely derails our life, you know, the way we trust, the way we're in relationships with other people. But when you said your experience, Nancy, it's interesting because, you know, we hear boys will be boys because we often think that boys or penises are the culprit of sexual violence, and you know, and in my experience, my abuser or my harm doer was my sister, a female, and it happened to me when I was a little girl. I'm transgender, and so that was a really difficult thing to even comprehend. Learning first and foremost as a child that men are abusers, period. That was kind of interesting. I learned that before I knew anything, that penises were harmful and men were scary, and yet there was a female doing these things to me, and someone that I looked up to and admired and loved so deeply, and the power dynamic that was given from my parents to, you know, to my sister, and I guess to other siblings: take care of your little sister, listen to your big sister, you know, do what your big sister says. And so it's really was very confusing then, and then later on in life as well, because we're constantly trying to assess who am I from that, out of that experience, and questioned by society as well when determining your sexuality. Oh, you are this because this happened to you. You are this way because that happened to you. So very confusing for me, and really impacted just how I related to people and related to my own body and my own desires.
Yeah, and I think you make that great point there about how we tend as a society, and even as a family, but as a society, to say you are X because of X, or this is why you're saying what you're saying, and without a real understanding of what they're talking about. These are the positions that we take.
Right.
Everyone on this call is guilty of that in some way to some other subject in life. We tend to compartmentalize things, and we do that. But when we are talking about something so traumatic as any form of child sexual abuse, but in this conversation, sibling sexual abuse, making that assumption of you are X because of X does such a disservice. And not only a disservice, it's traumatizing to hear that. as you're just alluding to, right? It's really traumatizing for someone to stand there and say to me, you are X because of X. You respond this way because of that. You respond this way because of what your brother did or said, or you respond this way because your family didn't pay attention. All of these sorts of things, trying to come up with this explanation, which helps society, to me, push the information back and not deal with it as a whole. But I have to jump to you, Phil, because I'm just going to be nasty this way and jump to you. One of the things I know my husband has a hard time with is the general assumptions in society about explaining men's behavior. Okay. And I'm going to go there. I'm sorry. And I'm going to take you with me. But for someone like yourself, who's been through the experiences that you have, to hear that quintessential boys will be boys bullshit, what do you hear in your head?
Well, I mean, I think that it gets at this societal understanding and definition of what masculinity is, what it means to be a man, that I think both inhibits, men from speaking out about being abused sexually by their siblings, whether they were abused by a brother or a sister. Um, and also, it really kind of it narrows the focus of what your experience can be and what is acceptable behavior in a person, but especially in young boys, you know in terms of what's expected of them, how they're expected to behave. And so I think that, the boys will be boys idea is applied to perpetrators in that sense, but it also is just as equally important in terms of what happens to survivors of sibling sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, because you grow up with these thoughts and these ideas of, well, I'm supposed to be this way because this is what it means to be a man. This is what it means to be tough. This is what it means to be strong. And so that, I think, has a very powerful warping effect on just how you are, how you act, and how you process your trauma. And I do think that, as I said at the top, it just really inhibits a lot of male survivors in particular from speaking out.
Thank you for that. Bryn, I'm going to ask you to jump in here because in your work, you must see these dynamics about sibling relationships. And in a minute, we're going to expand that out to how then, people behave in society and the impact of SSA on society. But for now, what have you seen in your work or in your life as it relates to what we're talking about here with regard to the sibling relationship, the messages that are sent to children by these sorts of things as Ignacio and Phil were just talking about?
Yeah, I think in terms of like the sibling relationships and dynamics, a lot of things get pushed aside or swept under the rug. And I know a lot of people that that have been abused by siblings, not just sexually, but physical abuse, emotional abuse, all sorts of things that happen with siblings, where a lot of the times it's just like, oh, that's just your brother, or oh, that's just your sister, and but if this was coming from somebody else outside of the family, it would probably be taken more seriously. And so that is definitely one issue that I see as like a big societal issue, is not really having parents not taking it as seriously, but then also when it's being disclosed to somebody else, outside of the family, them maybe not taking it as seriously. And I think because, kind of going back to that original question of like, because the bond between siblings is so strong and so impactful, it actually can cause more damage to a relationship because of the type of relationship that it is. And I know for me, that was a huge part of it, kind of what Ignacio was sharing around, like, looking up to, their sibling and how that was for them. And like, I felt the exact same way. I held my brother on a pedestal a mile high, and I wanted to do everything my brother wanted to do. And that necessarily wasn't happening with other people outside the family. And so yeah, that betrayal was a really big issue. And I think as I went about my healing, one thing I had to really grieve was the loss of that connection that I had. And I think that's a missing piece also in our healing process in society. Society can often think of perpetrators as, oh, they're bad, and don't ever speak to them again, and really like shunning them from society in a lot of ways, and in some ways understandable completely, and in other ways it doesn't allow room for sadness of the loss of that relationship, the grief of that relationship, and all the love that comes with you know the confusion that comes with loving somebody who has also hurt you a lot. So I think that's a really important component that a lot of times people don't really understand when they're kind of on the outside looking in.
I think you bring up not only a great point about the grief, because you're grieving not only a relationship that may have in many ways been fulfilling for you, for a person, but then also quite traumatic at the same time. But then we also have to grieve the loss of what we had hoped the relationship would be, or in that moment, and also the future of that relationship. When I was little, I saw myself growing up being protected by my two brothers, and
Mhm.
we're going to be 60 and over, and and they're still going to be there. We'll be having Thanksgiving dinner and all that sort of stuff, and that's just gone. So yeah, I mean the really important aspects of grief and the misunderstanding of society that you can't just always flick a switch. And we already know this. I think this is my opinion. I'd be happy to hear what others have to think. We always sort of say, even when we're talking about, which is a subject I don't know much about, so I'm not going to dive too much, but say domestic violence. Well, why don't you just leave? And like you were saying, Bryn, well, why don't you just not see your brother or sister again? Why don't you just not bother? And I know I've cut off contact from my brothers, but for different reasons. But that was over the course of like 20 or 30 years that I made that decision to cut off that contact. It's not like I can just move out of the house and that's it. So I think that's another thing that people don't fully understand about why can we still be traumatized about a relationship, because that's what it is, as well as the events themselves. It's the trauma that comes from a relationship that's damaged, and a relationship that the damage, I know from a survivor point of view, and also what the research shows with sibling sexual abuse, one of the big key differences between this and other forms of, say, adult to child abuse or whatever, is the repeated triggers, the repeated micro traumas. So, even in my 40s, if I'm expected to show up to a family dinner or say a family funeral, and I haven't disclosed, or I have disclosed and the family's dismissed it, or things like that, then I'm showing up in a space and I have to stand there by my abuser. And I think that's a piece that's missing as well. And I'm seeing lots of nods there too. So anybody want to jump in on that thought about this idea of micro traumas that continue long past the actual physical abuse might end? Ignacio.
Yeah, it just interestingly enough, I haven't been to my mother's house in years. Actually, it was something that I decided for myself that I was going to step away from, because it was where the abuse happened, and there's no kind of acknowledgement of that. Well, it is known, but there's no conversation whatsoever about it. And I went to go visit my mom recently, and emotionally, the meeting was lovely. I worked on my boundaries. I knew what I wanted, and I was able to be there. But interestingly enough, my body was not happy. My entire system was completely out of whack. I was suffering so much from my body, and it's like, Maria, you were talking about your book, and it's like I had chronic migraine since I was a child, and it is very much through my therapist, and everyone believes that that is very much directly connected to that. So it's like my body still feels the trauma in that house, and I'm still working that out. Even, I mean, it's been since I was like 7 years old or something. I'm 52, and I am still like deep in that pain when I go to that house, you know. So I think it's something that I call it, I think I refer to this as existential trauma. We don't talk about this, the severity of the trauma that just unfolds throughout our life because of that initial relationship. Our family, our parents, and our siblings are the first real connection or idea of a connection that we have ever known. And for others, that might be in foster care, that might be elsewhere. So that also shifts these kinds of relationships. So it's like almost the most important building block for a relationship, and that was completely destroyed. That building block, it's not a good foundation. So that continues to be a rocky foundation for the rest of our lives until we go back in there and try to put that block right where it was taken out. You know, it's like, it's just continual healing. Yeah, it's continual healing and introspective work to really get to that place of understanding, you know, what we need and what our body and our mind is telling us.
Can I ask you just to, the notion of existential anything can be confusing for people.
Mhm.
So can you just explain that phrase, like existential crisis or trauma, just in
Yes.
different words?
It's basically, I see it as, it screws your whole sense of being, who you are. Like, you're born to live a life, and that life was completely altered by that event. It rocks you right off of it. It's like the life you were supposed to live is now altered that way or that way or that way. That shifted it. And now you are accommodating for that. And so you are living a different life, trying to heal and get back to whatever it is you are. I'm not talking about, how you make money or who you are as a, like who you are, like, who am I? Who am I? What do I like? What do I desire? What makes me happy? What makes me sad? Everything we've learned, we're in these familial dynamics, which are very much power dynamics. So when I say existential, it's because we are questioning everything after something like this. Everything, our relationships, who we are, who we love, how we want to have sex, everything.
Yeah.
So to me, it is something that we all have to talk about. Like, this is not something that just happens and then maybe years go by and stuff. It is something that you walk with. So you walk with it in different ways. I'm not talking we have to suffer all the time.
Yeah.
But we walk with it in different ways for the rest of our life.
And Maria, and then Gloria. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything Ignacio said. Also, I just wanted to get to your question. I have an example of how I'm triggered still. I'm 58, almost 59. And, abuse happened when I was 10. So I just recently, in this last year, started having these heart palpitations, and I couldn't figure out why. And it was in therapy. We finally realized that I was observing something going on in my family, not directly even with me, watching a family member kind of being taken advantage of. And that, it turns out, I reacted to that so strongly. And it wasn't until we realized that in therapy that all of a sudden the heart palpitations stopped again. But it was for months. It was going on for months, and we couldn't figure out why. I couldn't figure out why. So even to this day, I'll be okay for a long time, I think. And then something like this gets triggered, and I have to kind of dig down and figure out what's going on. But I know it's because I felt taken advantage of and watching, and I felt like I had to save this person that I was seeing being, abused in my mind. So like that just put me back into that situation. So to this day, it still happens.
I think it reinforces the notion that this is something, and all trauma, let's say all trauma, but we're talking about sibling sexual abuse today, but it's not something you actually get over. It changes you, it lives with you. You can work with it, you can use it, you can grow from it for sure. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's not something that anybody gets over. Gloria, you have a thought?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. So Ignacio, I love what you said, and I think underlying that, all of that is safety. And we're talking about the intrinsic safety as well as the extrinsic. And I know for me, feeling safe was never available. And even at times now, as 63, nearly 64 years of age, there are times when I don't feel safe. And if I see someone who looks like my brother, I'm immediately transported back. But even more than that, and I think, Bryn, you mentioned it as well, it's about the grief and loss. And for me, what happened the minute I accused my brother, I then, from that point, lost my whole family. It was almost that quick. The family then closed ranks and decided, you're the evil, deluded, fill in the gaps. We've all been called things because of because of the truth. So I think, grief is huge, because usually, and this is what I'd love society to know, usually with sibling sexual abuse, the levels of trauma and dysfunction go so deep and they're so varied that it's hard for us as survivors to wrap our heads around it. And when I say that, I mean, here's a survivor trying to, for instance, call out the truth of what happened. That person, that older sibling, my brother, decides, no, I'm never going to admit that, so you're wrong. So then one by one, the whole family aligned with, and so society needs to realize it's not one trauma. This goes on and on and on. And something you said earlier as well, Nancy, was, those Christmases or those gatherings, that's gone. And you can be left in a position where you now have to recreate a life without. So I think that's quite important for people to understand.
Phil, thank you, Gloria. Phil.
I think that everything Gloria just said is true. It's also true that that can happen and does happen even in cases where the abuser admits to the abuse and it's accepted by parents. Those effects can still very much happen because there is just still so much stigma and taboo and shame surrounding sibling sexual abuse, incest, child sexual abuse, that, the adult parents, if they're alive and they're told about something that happened in childhood, might, react really negatively and say, like, I don't, even if I admit, or accept that this happened, I don't want to be associated with you, the person who's disclosing, or there's just a lot of complex emotions that can get stirred up, even in cases that are sort of like, good cases where people are believed and where abusers admit, that they abused. So I think that that's important for people out there to know as well.
And that we're-
Absolutely. Bryn, go ahead.
Yeah, I think understanding for society to understand that it is a family trauma and it affects every single member of the family. And I know my family didn't necessarily treat it like that. It would, and it exploded the family, and everybody kind of had their own ways of dealing, but the entire family after disclosure was never going to be the same. And that in itself is a trauma. And the loss and the holidays and even like every time one of my parents tried to get me to talk to my brother, or tried everything in their power to make us the happy family that they thought we were, every time that happened, that was one of those micro traumas that you were referring to. And so it just completely shatters this entire family unit. And I think that's super important for people to understand, is it's not just something that happened between two siblings. It's something that changes your dynamic with your parents. It changes your dynamic with your other siblings. It, changes how you feel about, aunts, uncles, cousins, because now all of a sudden I have some people who don't know but so am I allowed to talk about my book that's coming out? Or am I allowed to, like there's all these kind of ways of navigating that it kind of feels like you're navigating a minefield. And like, older grandparents, okay, do you want them to know? Do you not want them to, right? It's just all of these different facets. And I think it gets really, if you're not aware of it and if you don't know about it, you might not think about all the repercussions that come from having abuse between two siblings.
And I think you bring up a really important point too, when you're saying it changes the dynamic of the whole family. And to me, I think it changes the dynamic with or without disclosure. Definitely with disclosure, but even without disclosure. So I remember my other brother, the one who was not involved in the abuse, when there was a conversation between the three of us, and he heard some of what my other brother had to say. And after that phone conversation, he phoned me up and said, now I know what happened to you and why you went from a fun little girl, because I was the littlest of the lot of us, from this fun loving, just shut down. You were a different person entirely. There was no disclosure when we were younger. It was only later in life, but it did change the course of the family. It did, even with no disclosure. But okay, so devil's advocate here. Why should society care whether that family down the street has had their world blown up? Like, why should they care? Now, I'm going to answer that in part myself, because I know from research, granted, research needs to be done. And Jane, I'm going to ask you to pipe up on this one because we haven't heard from you yet. So I really want to hear from you. But we know that the impacts of sibling sexual abuse across the range of behaviors that are currently within the definition of sibling sexual abuse, we have things like teen suicide, teen homelessness, drugs and alcohol addiction, costs and expenses associated with anxiety and depression, difficulty with with work, people being able to work because of things that will trigger them at work. So poor work performance is related to trauma, and particularly sexual trauma, and what we believe to be SSA trauma. So it impacts the workplace. It impacts the other aspects of community living, such as, people choosing not to be married or not to be in relationships. So they're both the person who was harmed and the one who caused harm choose not to be in relationships, changes the dynamic of the community that way. And we know, and from what I understand in my initial research, looking at the economic costs of what is currently known of child sexual abuse, generally, we are talking trillions of dollars worldwide. I think in the United States, the suggested economic costs are something like 30 or 40 billion dollars a year directly related to child sexual abuse and dealing with those traumas. In Canada, because we're so much smaller, it's only about 5 or 6 billion. And in the United Kingdom, we're back up to the 20, 30 billion again. So we know all of that. But with all of that being said, Jane and everybody else on the call, why should society care whether or not a family is disrupted when they have their own stuff going on?
Well, you asked me to speak
Yes.
first, so I will speak to, I can share my personal experience. I'm kind of a classic case, I guess you could say, when you look at back hindsight, like, oh, of course, I was rebellious. I was skipping school. I was doing drugs. I was doing mushrooms. I was driving I was driving high on mushrooms in high school. That's not a good thing. I'm lucky to be alive. And then I became incredibly promiscuous. Relationships were transactional. I ended up on the stage as a stripper, again, exposed to drugs, alcohol, violence. Again, lucky I'm alive. Those are just some aspects of it. And then thinking that I was okay and I had pushed it into a little box and I was fine. I wasn't messed up. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was just my sibling. It isn't impacting my life. But yet at age 45, I was at the bottom. I was incredibly depressed and I couldn't find the answers. I'd given up alcohol. I had tried antidepressants. I was in 5 years of marriage counseling. And I always joked that we put my therapist 3 kids through college and I still wasn't finding the answers. So all that money on therapy, antidepressants, and a teenager driving high on the road, suicide attempts, all the things. And one thing I will say, it still impacts me today. even in my marriage, in that I think that trauma impacted my learning capabilities, and I luckily married a smart man, and now I'm being outsmarted by my children, and I feel like how can I add to society? I'm not sure that I actually feel competent enough to add to society, because I feel like I learn very differently from the trauma. Just a few things. The list goes on.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to respond to that last comment you made about contributing to society. Like, come on, but like, just the work you do around the sibling sexual abuse subject is massive and huge and has changed lives. So I'm not very good with algebra. That doesn't mean that I can't, you know what I mean? Like, you know, we find our paths, and I know that you have contributed to society, but I take on board what you're saying about how you feel. It may have changed your actual ability, your brain function, in one level or another. And I'm sure Gloria and Bryn, who both have the training in these sorts of things, they're both nodding, going, yeah, we know in the science that brain function, brain physiology will change, and or could change, doesn't have to. But you bring up really important points, and you say really important things about the behaviors you did or the choices that you made that actually impact broader society. I don't think people draw that line when they're talking about what's happening in that family down the street. I don't think they draw the line to the possibility that in one form or another, no matter what we're talking about when it comes to intrafamilial trauma, it does show up on the doorstep of everybody on that street, one way or another. And I don't think people truly understand. We just try and push it away. Now, we don't have to go around with picnic baskets to everybody's door and try and help everybody, because you know, people, neighbors don't have to, society as a whole. But I personally believe that there's a degree of responsibility that society has, myself included, for holding stigma towards certain subjects or certain groups of people or certain situations in society. That stigma, I know for me, I've been on my healing journey for 40 some years now. I will tell anybody about sibling sexual abuse. I'll tell anybody I don't care anymore. But I know for me, it makes a difference when I can turn around to somebody and say to them, this is part of my life experience, the same way I might say my mom died when I was 20, and that had a significant impact on my life. That person, if I say my mom died when I was 20, that person will not squirrel up their nose. They will not make strange faces at me. They will have genuine sympathy or empathy for my situation. If I say to them, I'm a survivor of sibling sexual trauma, it's like, how the hell can I get out of this room fast enough? So it's until society is able to accept that these things go on, and that people around them, if statistics are to be believed, probably 1 in 10 of the people around them has been harmed by sibling sexual abuse or was a perpetrator of sibling sexual abuse. So until society does that in terms of stigma, I think we're going to be stuck. And this is why this conversation is so important, Ignacio.
That connects directly to what I was going to say in terms of, you know, we've spoken a little bit about grief. And I think grief is super, super important to talk about, because just as you said, we can all talk about someone who has passed, a car accident that happened, someone who's in the hospital. We can tell anybody that, you know, and people will be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened. That happened to me too. We share stories. We say, yeah, my dad died, or you know, this happened or that. And we have ceremonies. I mean, hundreds of people come to funerals to say goodbye. We have memorials year after year for people who have passed, because it's so important to talk about that grief. The grief is like, especially collective grief. We have been denied collective grief over these topics, like to grieve with people, to say, I am a survivor of this, and someone to say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Maybe that's not my experience, but thank you for sharing that. Or allowing someone to cry in their presence. Like it's still wrapped up in shame so badly that we don't have the ability to grieve openly and honestly. And that's also connected to gratitude, because when someone passes and we grieve, even with all the emotional turmoil we go through, you know, even anger and stuff, we get to a point of gratitude, for that person, for situations. We understand things differently after processing those emotions. We've had time to do that, and we've had support. We don't get that, and generally speaking, when it comes to topics of this nature, and so that grief, I think, is really important, because that also connects to the witnessing, and for people to know that this is happening, that this is educational, this is known throughout society. This is a topic of conversation. This is something that we should be talking about.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, commend everything Ignacio just said. And to build on it, I'm a poet. There's this term in poetry called negative capability, which basically refers to the ability to accept the unknown and deal with unanswered questions. And I think that the unacknowledged trauma and grief that seeps out from a family, you know, even if it's not talked about or discussed, or even if there's not that communal grief and understanding, it's not as if it doesn't have an effect. It has an effect. It's just there. It's like this negative energy, this negative space, that is being taken up in society, and that is affecting society by the people who have experienced this trauma. So even if it's not outwardly acknowledged, it's still there, it's still happening. And so I think that that's why it's really important for society to reckon with it, because you might want to turn away from it or get out of that room, like you were saying, Nancy, but that doesn't mean that it's going to go away. That doesn't mean that it's not happening. That doesn't mean that the effects of it aren't going to continue to ripple out.
Absolutely. And I think people often equate ignoring something with it going away. Like, we ignore, so therefore it doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and that is, I don't think people who, and for the grace of God, there are tens of millions of hundreds of millions of people, billions of people on this earth who will never experience or have never experienced sibling sexual trauma. So good on them. However, because not everybody, but because so many people struggle to face something that's difficult, it seems easier to just ignore it. Yet at the same time, if I say something to someone who cares about me, I say this thing happened, and the other person is still trying to ignore it, it still lives in our relationship somewhere. Sort of as you were saying, Phil, as this sort of negative energy. There's an energy there that does exist, whether we look at it or not. It's like saying, something in the universe. I can't see atoms, but they exist. I need a really high-powered microscope, but they exist. So we can deny it all we like, but they're there. Hence, like, I'm made up of a bunch of them. So this is one of the reasons why I think society can play an active role in reducing their stigma, so that they can be educated and engaged, and even taking a preventative role. Gloria, did you have your hand up to say something?
Yeah. Look, I think what you're really talking about is called cognitive dissonance. And for those that don't understand what that is, it's simply what happens when someone hears about something that goes against their ethics, morals, and values. And most good people, let's gift them with that, are that. So to hear about sibling sexual abuse immediately takes them back into, that's terrible, that's horrible, I can't even relate. So they tend to look away. What I'm saying would be helpful, and I think should happen, is they need to start looking forward, because I don't think we have the luxury anymore of looking away. And so the way we do that is we start to normalize a conversation. And it's forums like these, it's the work that Maria and Jane are doing with 5 Waves. It's people like me who run Handing the Shame Back. It's about having conversations constantly, so that more and more it becomes more acceptable. I think we're just simply talking about society unable to come on board or accept or allow this to be a thing. because it's too hard for them to accept. So I think what we're really needing to do is to start to normalize those conversations and bring people in.
I agree with that too, because we saw that with normalizing the conversation about abuse in the Catholic Church, about now abuse in sports teams and things like that. There was a period of time in my lifetime, and that we wouldn't have spoken about abuse in the Catholic Church, but it's been going on for such a long time. But after repeated conversations and pushing the information out there and having these conversations and getting people on the bandwagon, finally it's become a conversation that society is willing to have. And society gets pissed off about it too. They don't, they're mad at the church or whatever for these things occurring. And Ignacio, I want to bring you in because I just want to go on from what Gloria was saying in terms of cognitive dissonance, because one of the things about cognitive dissonance, when your behaviors and your attitudes aren't matching, the person who is holding that dissonance doesn't realize that in actual fact, it's really negative for them to be holding that dissonance. And they endeavor to square it, as it were. They endeavor to make it right by either changing a behavior or an attitude. But that can't be held for a long time. I'm sure you'll agree with that, Gloria. For a person who's trying to, say, looking in from the outside, they hear about sibling sexual abuse. On the one hand, it's like, oh my God, that's really horrible, particularly now as it is getting a little bit more press. That's really, really horrible, but I'm not going to do anything about it, or I'm going, so they're confusing, their attitudes and the behaviors aren't aligning. That's basically what I'm saying. That person doesn't realize that by not aligning themselves, what they're doing is creating their own, not trauma as such, but own cognitive discomfort. And Ignacio, I know that fundamentally, or maybe not fundamentally, but one of the positions of your perspective and your organization is the notion that as a society, we need to heal ourselves in order to be available to hear and to deal with the other things that are going on in the world. Am I catching that right?
Yes, I mean, that's basically our tagline. We believe that in order to end child sexual abuse, sibling sexual abuse, sexual violence, that we just need to heal. So heal to end everything. Because a lot of times when we talk about this, we think, oh, I'm not a survivor, or that's not my experience, so I have no healing to do, or that's not my topic. But we say it is everyone's topic. And healing, we're healing from relational, trauma, relational dynamics. We're healing from not actually having the capacity to understand or the capacity to heal from these things. So I think a lot of times people don't know how to respond, or either jump straight to, they want to, offer a lot of advice when you don't ask for it, or they want to do something nice because they just don't know what to do. And it is really a lack of emotional capacity, or and I'm talking about every one of us as humans. We haven't had the ability to sharpen those tools of how to deal with our emotions, how to deal with trauma, how to deal with when something feels a certain way, how we express it. We're in a society that we don't tend to get told to express our feelings very much. And here we're expressing a lot. And so we're asking people to hold those feelings or to witness those feelings. And that's just too much, I think. So when I talk about healing, it's about even getting to a place to know that we have the capacity to be compassionate, empathetic, emotional. We can hear people's pain. We don't have to come up with the solutions, but we can, be in community with that pain, mourn, grieve. So that's the kind of healing I'm talking about, because when we're able to have that kind of stability in our own selves, that's able to reverberate into our families and our communities, and we're able to hold and support people rather than to be like, oh, I don't know what to say, and shame, or that's a horrible thing that happened, but I have no idea what to do. And it's really more about experiencing and understanding those emotions, right? That's what we do the rest of our lives as survivors. We're getting into practice as to understand why we do certain things, why things are like that. We have to be introspective. The healing process is about introspection and really understanding who we are. And so that's what I think about how everyone needs to do this type of work, and it's about getting to a place of our emotional capacity, what we're able to understand. Right, I think right now we deal with a lot of we understand rage, we understand physical, manifestations of anger and stuff. We don't really understand how we can emotionally navigate these traumas. We going through alcoholism, drug addiction. We go through so many things because we just don't know how to handle those emotions. And once we start through therapy, through art therapy, through whatever mechanism we have had the privilege of having, we start figuring things out for ourselves. And if we're lucky, we have community that is doing the same thing, and we can do it together.
And I want to just sort of extend on that conversation, because I think now, and I love the way you put that. And I think now we want to turn our attention to things related to prevention and intervention when it comes to sibling sexual abuse in a more specific kind of way, because I think what you're talking about leads to what are our opportunities as a society to not only be able to manage our emotions and speak about our emotions and things like that, but how can that being able to do that as individuals within a society play into preventing all sorts of things, and in this case, sibling sexual abuse. And Gloria and Bryn and myself, I mean, we're trained in sort of counseling and psychotherapy and psychology and all that sort of stuff. And I'm sure you'll agree, there are things that you go through in training and in practice that help you to hold your emotions, hold other people's emotions, be able to manage these sorts of things. And I would imagine you would also agree that most of society doesn't know how to do that. And most of society is highly reactive and yeah, yeah, Jane's not me. No, I'm perfect. Yeah. But this idea that, instead of only or really changing our conversation to how do we take all of that information and go into prevention mode and also intervention, because I also want society to realize that the impacts of sibling sexual abuse are huge. They really are. People don't fully understand it, and hence the idea of having more and more of these conversations. But sibling sexual abuse is considered one of the more preventable forms of CSA for a variety of reasons, not least of which is because there are micro education moments in a family dynamic that can, for example, reinforce the importance of the sibling relationship. Let's talk about prevention then. And let's do that from the perspective of society and society's role in prevention. We've alluded to it already. Society managing its own emotions and learning to heal as individuals, learning to heal and learning that we all have to heal, or all are on this journey of healing from life, from our experiences in life. So that's a point there. Gloria, do you have anything about this idea of society's role in prevention?
Look, my question is always, if not you, then who? Again, I don't think anyone has the luxury of looking away anymore. We have to lean into this. And I want to give society some hope because, I think you mentioned earlier, Nancy, the Catholic Church, it was completely taboo in terms of any ridicule or criticism or judgment of them. Now it's 100% accepted out there that this is a mainstream abusing environment. I see more and more people coming out every day around their abuse, and I know that's my jam and that's where I operate. But it's also, I get people reaching out saying, did you see what was in the news? So what we don't realize, and I think this is quite beautiful, team, every time we tell our story, we're advocating. Did you know that? Because even if one person hears you, they then get permission to share. And because this is so prevalent, there are going to be non-survivors who hear, listen, respect, and try and support. So I'm holding the hope. And again, I'm just trying to say to people, if not you, then who? Please lean in.
I like that phrase, lean in. Bryn, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Gloria was saying. Actually, I told somebody about my childhood experience just the other day, and for the first time, it was somebody who said, "Oh, I know somebody else who experienced that." And that is not the typical response. Usually it's, "Oh, wow," or, sometimes, "Oh, me too," or, something like that. But to have somebody like on the outside who hasn't experienced that be like, "Oh, yeah, that was like something that I've heard about." So that was hopeful. But in general, like, I think kind of what I said earlier, we think the home, the family is kind of this immune place where bad things don't happen. And a lot of times parents can turn a blind eye to things, or they'll feel something off but like won't necessarily address it or know how to address it or don't want to make things awkward. So I think that there's a lot that can be done, especially also with teachers just being aware of what looks like trauma, and what that looks like, and how can you have conversations and bring more awareness. I know that there are people out there speaking at schools, and that's one thing that I hope to do, is share more of my stories in like college settings, because we're kind of you're at that age where you're out of the house and there's a little bit more space there, and it can allow for people to be reflective. And I know a lot of times, like with me specifically, like I didn't know to call it abuse when it was happening. It was only after that, or an adult was able to kind of help me with that. So sometimes there needs to be some of that space. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't abuse. And that's another thing that society can understand, is just because it wasn't violent, or something like that, or just because everything seemed okay in the house growing up and you seemed like you were fine. Yeah, on some level I was. Sure. On some level I was a great athlete. On some level I was still, doing well in school and, doing performances and, all that. But not looking at that as like, "Oh, you're just crying victim now. Like, what changed?" No, I'm just now revealing a part of myself that wasn't safe to reveal before. And I think the more safety we can create as a society with everything that has been discussed already, of like just having that empathy, having that awareness of, "Oh yeah, even though I haven't been through this, and maybe I don't know somebody who has, or maybe they haven't talked about it, that doesn't mean that it's severely impacting people." So I think that that's just like a really important point in society that can take, is like, yeah, it's okay to kind of create safety around talking about it more.
Absolutely, the safety piece, and that sort of goes on from what you said, Gloria, earlier about a high need for safety. I have a high need for safety, and if I feel safe, there's a whole lot of stuff I can achieve, and if I don't, that's a difficult thing. And people who have never experienced SSA or even any form of CSA can still support people by helping them to be safe. We've talked about it before, about how we respond to people who want to share information with us is a really important thing. And anybody can learn that. Anybody can learn how to be open to receive any form of disclosure without your face dropping, and for anybody who has disclosed, we know that the first few seconds of that disclosure are super important to the person who's disclosing. I mean, just they're vital. They're vital to. So when I heard boys will be boys, I didn't talk to anybody about it for another year or so before I came back around and said, okay, I have to keep marching on here, and I have to keep on my own path of healing. Not saying anything against the person who said it. They were from a completely different generation than me. And this was like, 40 years ago. So really a different generation. But, we talk a lot about how for me in my age, I'm in my 60s, sort of the quote unquote younger generation, and people who are now, Bryn, I think it's amazing if you want to go speak in colleges, not only because there will be people there who have been harmed or were harming a sibling, but there will be others who will potentially care enough to learn how to be there if somebody needs to disclose anything to them. Because I don't know if society as a whole, or even communities generally, understand the importance of being able to receive somebody's disclosure about something that is important to them. You know, when we're in an intimate relationship with somebody, we try and do our level best to hear what they might have to say, but we don't necessarily think too much about it when it's a friend or just, you know, just somebody in society. Because I don't know about you guys, but I really hate trolls. And when I see some of the stuff on the internet that's come out after, for example, the Hollyoaks storyline and the soap opera in the United Kingdom, so a recent storyline, just the trolls on the internet. And I know there will always be trolls and stuff, but I don't think people pause long enough to realize that, first off, you wouldn't say that to somebody in their face, saying, oh, this is crap, this never happens, these people are terrible, you know, all that sort of stuff. But also just the damage that that can do to somebody who's had some sort of trauma. Just like if the person who wrote that had recently, say, lost a parent, and I went up to them and said, oh, who cares, it was just your mother. You know, like it's the same. People don't get that in their head. So I'm droning on here. Jane, in 5 Waves, you guys do a lot of good work around prevention and also about providing information to those who have had disclosure through your siblingsexualtrauma.com website. So just plug that there for you. And what, in terms of prevention, what does society need to know and do about sibling sexual abuse?
Well, first of all, through 5 Ways, we are able to approach it from a lived experience. So I think that, you know, I know I'd heard from parents on the internet, but when I actually connected with the parents of 5 Waves and we sat down over a Zoom call and I heard their stories, it transformed me. But as far as society goes, you know, we are talking to our children more and more about sexual abuse in general, even though still many people still have their blinders on about that. It's just, so I live in California. Here's an example. I think the candy Skittles is being banned because of some red dye, and I think Cheetos is on the list next because of the orange dye, because we want to prevent our children from getting cancer. That's okay to talk about. This is a cancer. It's a whole family trauma. And it's, to me, you just talk about it. It's not, we're having a completely normal conversation. We just, when we're talking to our children about body safety, which I hope most parents are, you add in siblings, cousins, older adolescents. It's a normal conversation. And I think it was Bryn that touched on it earlier about if you're a parent and you have a gut instinct and you suspect something, use that. You know, sit down and talk to your kids. We need to have an open door policy with our kids anyway. But to me, it's so simple. We just talk about it. We just normalize the conversation.
Yeah, as Gloria was saying, right? Have enough of the conversations that we normalize it. But a question for you, devil's advocate, Jane. What I often hear people say to me is, if I bring this up with my children, it's either going to give them an idea or it's going to frighten the kids and they're not going to want to have relationships with their sibling or something along those lines. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert. I will share with you that the day I was giving my TEDx talk, the day before, my husband and I were standing outside the venue looking at it. And this woman walked by and she said, oh, what's going on over here? And my husband is so proud. He's like, my wife's giving a TEDx talk tomorrow. And she said, oh, really? What's it about? And I was all excited. I said, it's about sibling sexual abuse. And turns out she's a therapist. And she was horrified. She said, well, you're just going to freak all the parents out. All their kids are going to be afraid to hug each other and it's going to go overboard. And it was a day before my TEDx. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I had to realize she wasn't my audience. So I am not an expert in this field. However, there are lots of body safety people out on the internet, and I can give you their names. And they have books. You know, Gloria's got a book. I haven't read her book. There's lots of people out there who will guide you, who offer courses, offer books to talk to your children about body safety. I'm not an expert in that. And my kids have been talked to about body safety. Their eyeballs are rolling in the back of their head. But yeah.
Gloria, I'm going to come to you and just follow on. And then Maria, in terms of parents or society saying, if we talk about this, we're going to freak people out, we're going to scare children, and we're going to make parents feel really, really uncomfortable? Because as much as sibling sexual abuse occurs at a very high rate, quote unquote, in relation to other things, for sure, many families will not experience this. So are they valid in saying, if we talk about it too much, we're going to freak people out and or give children ideas?
I think it comes back to exactly what Jane said. And just one quick thing, Jane, you know what expert is, don't you? X marks the spot, drip under pressure. Look, we just lived experience. We have lived experience. That's where we're experts. Look, I think parents, one thing I always feel strongly about, and it's in the book, is we've got to start giving parents back the power and the autonomy to trust their instinct. So much of what is given to them is confusing or manipulative, or they're taking they're swallowing the Kool-Aid. I think it's time for people to start to trust what they see in their own child. You are the person who can distinguish your baby's cry from anybody else in the room. You are the person that knows by a simple look whether or not they're okay. So I think it's about reading that. And one of the things I will say is this: it's, in my humble opinion, it's not so much that we talk to children, because children's main way of communicating is actually through their behaviour and through their play. It's about us learning to read their language, which is what they're doing. For instance, when I was a kid at school, I was out of control. I was the kid that was always being kicked out of the classroom, stealing, lying, attention seeking, but no teacher was picking up what I was putting down. And my point is this: if we can start working with children where they're at, meeting them where they're at, giving them things like the hand sign, teaching them body safety rules, as Jane talked about, actually getting the family to choose an emoji that they all vote on, so that if a child is not feeling safe, they can flick it through to mum or dad. To talk about, or a trusted adult. So there's lots of ways we can communicate with children so they have permission to communicate back. Talking is an adult construct, so I think we need to work with children where they're at. So again, it's all in the book, and I'm just grateful I'm able to bring that wisdom forth, only because I went through what I did. So yeah, that's what I would say. But Jane's on the money, as is Bryn. Look, it's all their team. We know what needs to happen, but I think if we think about gatekeepers, I think parents are the gatekeepers. We need to go through them, and there's ways of doing it. So yeah,
I think these conversations help parents and society to understand the importance of continuing their education. I mean, that is one of the desired outcomes of the SiblingsToo Day, is people to be and feel it, that they are learning, so more educated, and then to be engaged, to either carry on their education or to get engaged at some level. And Maria, I know you had a thought, and then I want to move on to interventions. Is sort of what society needs to know about interventions, because it's not all doom and gloom, but it is important we understand impacts and the things that can happen, and the dynamics and the costs of SSA. But there are some innovative interventions around the world. So Maria, what are your thoughts?
So I have so many thoughts in my head from all the conversations, but let me first talk about prevention in terms of 5 waves, for example. Like Jane said, there's all the body safety and all that kind of education, but the waves in 5 waves stands for worldwide awareness, voice, education, and support. Now, the support is really for supporting those who've gone through it, but really the awareness, voice, education, those are all, in my mind, preventative. So if we can get the awareness, which is what we're doing, and there's many different ways to do that too, even through the support groups that we have out there for those who've already experienced it. we are getting that group to be more vocal, to like come to a community and realize they are a community, and then they are finding their voice, the V in wave. And the educating the children, but educating the parents, like Gloria said. But we also have to recognize that trying to educate parents who don't want to know this, even if they have that gut feeling, denial is so much more of a fun place to be, you know, in all this. So they don't want to hear it. And we have to get over that. And I think that's where awareness again comes in, when we start flooding the media wherever we can get out this information of what is happening, what we're all going through with lived experience, and that it's real, it's happening. It could be happening in your family, in any family. It happens in every family, or not every, it could happen in any type of family. It can happen. So we have to make sure that the parents and the caregivers and the people who are watching the behaviors are aware of that, and not let them go to the denial. And just one more thing I do want to say about the acting out and all that. I think maybe Bryn and I were more similar. And, you know, I was a good student, the athlete. Nobody, my mother's a psychologist. And when I remembered at age 42 and told her, she was flabbergasted. And how could I have not seen this? Well, I repressed it. And I did a couple little things at the time to reach out, and it wasn't received. And it went down deep. So in my subconscious. So it's hard to know sometimes. So still having those conversations, no matter what. My brother had just been told, you don't do this, you don't touch your sister. That might have been it, you know. So it wasn't even on me to have to say, you know, don't come near me. Like, it should be coming from that end. So there's so many sides of it where education is important, and awareness. So I think that's my soapbox I'll get off of.
No, it's not a soapbox at all. It's really good comments going back to what Gloria said. We're all experts because we have lived experience. And I think that expertise, fortunately, is now being seen by others in the world. And now I know many of us are contributing to the conversation about prevention and also intervention. And I want us to move there before we need to wrap this call up, which is a fascinating call. And like always, I could keep talking to you guys for a really long time. But in terms of both prevention and intervention, one interesting thing, and this alludes to how society can shift when it gets engaged, when it learns, and when it decides it's going to be part of the solution, not the problem. In Australia, their approach to sibling sexual abuse and other forms of child abuse, but sibling sexual abuse specifically, leans more towards a public health issue, that the contributing factors, not causes, but some of the contributing factors may be related to things like brain development, mental health and coping strategies of the person who causes harm, and other things similar to that. And in a nutshell, it was spoken about last year's Awareness Day, and Dale Tolliday and Russ Pratt are back again this year to talk about it. The idea then is that because society is beginning to see it as a public health issue, parents are more likely to reach out for advice to prevent it in the first place, and they're more likely to reach out to the public health authorities when there is the possibility that it's occurring, or there's some, you know, that sixth sense that something might be going on. So even before there's disclosure, because they feel it's going to be deemed as a health issue, not a mental health issue, as if something's wrong, like fundamentally wrong with my child, but more of a health issue for all the family. And also when there is disclosure, again, the social services or child protection doesn't necessarily swoop in and just destroy the family. So that narrative change, the idea of people speaking about it differently, has actually changed the behavior of society, members of society, not all of society yet. There's still a long road to go. That's why I too am hopeful that by supporting the idea of, you know, what we're dealing with is two children. Granted, there's other, I'm going to screw this up by making it too simple, but you know, we are dealing with two children, and we don't necessarily have to take the approach that the person who causes harm is a monster. And we change that narrative, that we can maybe take the approach of a public health issue or something else. The point is if we change the narrative around a subject, more people will change their own narrative. if we change the narrative around sibling sexual abuse by all the things that we've talked about today, by educating and encouraging people to be engaged, then we're reaching out saying, you can change your narrative about how you see us, how you see this situation, and therefore your behavior can change. So from both a prevention and an intervention point of view, to me, that's an interesting way of potentially in future taking that more sort of public health where appropriate approach. But it's an example of how changing the story around the topic will change the stigma that society has for it. But there's other interventions that and we're all familiar with them, and they're spoken about in other parts of today's event. But I think we want to make sure that society also understands that those who have been harmed and those who cause harm can lead a full, rich life, particularly if there is disclosure. And as Maria, chronic pain came from memories being suppressed, from the situation being suppressed. Jane, you and me and Gloria, and I don't know about you, Bryn or Ignacio, I'm not going to go down that. Were you just big party animals and out there being all promiscuous? And Gloria, I'm not saying you were promiscuous, but you were, you were okay, you were, but, you acted out in school and all of these other things. I can't remember where I was going with this, but I'm sure it was really exciting. Somebody take over.
No, I will. Just quickly, and just to clarify, look, that's one example of what a child who's being abused by a sibling will show. But it's usually extreme. It can be children will show us through complete withdrawal, or being the A student and the A athlete, or what Bryn and Maria were describing earlier. 100%. The point is that we look for signs in children, and they will show us if we look. So I think that's really important. There is not one size fits all. There is not one symptom. There's such a big range. And again, it comes back to what people see. But,
yeah, absolutely. Ignacio, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I would like to say that when I think about, prevention, intervention, I would say that I think I don't agree with where prevention is right now, where it begins. Now, I'm not familiar with all your work, so I'm really excited to be looking at the organization and your books. But in my experience, prevention, I often say, should not start at the gut feeling that something is happening. Should not start at the first time you have the sex talk. It should not. So prevention, I feel, is actually intervention in some ways. It's not actually prevention, in my opinion. Prevention doesn't have to actually start with the abuse, or teaching about abuse, or teaching that this is a possibility. It can actually begin way before, without even mentioning abuse, because it's about listening to children and interacting with children in a way that they understand that they have the right to express their feelings, to talk about what they want for their own bodies, and for an adult to actually listen to them and listen to what they're saying about their bodies. That's where there's a big I think there's a bigger conversation about the power dynamics about parents that have over children, and how children have really no rights. And so when I think about prevention, I think about building up the tools in a child, or a human, really, which we all should have, to tap into our own intuition, so that they can say things or feel free. And that, I have to say, one of the things I've learned now that I have a grandson, it is, I shut up a lot more, and I listen, and with lots of curiosity. So I say, shut the hell up, and really listen to children, because you actually don't have to say, oh, you have to know about this abusive stuff. You listen to what kids are telling you. They tell you their daily lives. They tell you all of the interactions they have. And as an adult, you can decipher these things and say, here's a good conversation to have. There's a boundary that was passed there. Here's a great conversation to have with children about their bodies, without even using words like bodily autonomy, boundaries, negotiation, any of that stuff. We can do that. That, to me, is the prevention, where we build up a child, or let them know that they have their own power to build up, to say no, yes, that they could actually say that to their parents, and not be reprimanded, right? Because there comes a time where mostly when children are teenagers, where there is a butting heads with parents, right? Because they're coming into their own. And that's where the parent starts having to let go, or there's a big fight constantly. It really is about letting go of that power and allowing for children to learn on their own while they're supported by adults. So I think that's the prevention piece. And then there's conversations about, yes, we live in a society where these things happen and this and that, but not let that be the beginning point, because and then sex, relationships, all of it is soiled with abuse. We're totally terrified of talking about any kind of intimacy, because intimacy is associated with the possibility, and I talk about being socialized as a girl. And I think maybe all of you can probably agree with me, is that I knew about sexual assault, rape, men and penises before I understood anything about my own body, desire, anything, right? Because the parents thought this is where we start. We want to prevent and we want to keep safe. But in fact, we're creating a lot of fear because we're starting at this really heavy place when we can be starting off with the tools. Because if we don't have those tools, it helps to support conditions that, allow for CSA to happen, or these relational dynamics to happen.
Thank you for sharing that, the perspectives that you have there, Ignacio. I think they're really important, and a reminder that there's different approaches and different ways of looking at things, and that we don't have to go down just one single path to find our answers. But again, we need to be open to these possibilities of looking at things differently.
So my situation is probably very atypical, but my parents were very open. My psychologist mother, I had all that, and I still repressed it. So for me, I feel like there was that shame, and I feel like this is the stigma and the society putting that shame out there. Somewhere I got that, or it was my body. Maybe it's just a physiological thing. My body went to shame when whatever happened to it. So I don't even know if it's society. I don't know if it's that. Probably everything combined. But even given that I had that perfect opportunity, my mother was open, my parents were open, everything was great, and I could tell her anything, and I have a great and always had a great relationship with her, but I still held this in. So why is that? So that's where because that's my experience. I always wonder about that, and it gets back to the stigma, society, and getting awareness, and not only putting the onus on the child. Like, yes, I agree, Ignacio, everything you said. Like, don't make it this horrible thing. Just it's a teaching thing from day one when this child is born, of normal things. But at the same time, like I said, tell the what not to do sometimes too. There are boundaries. Talk about boundaries, and it doesn't have to be a scary thing, but talk about them in general. But to get to that point where, because it's such a taboo and such a stigma that the stuff between siblings just shouldn't and doesn't happen, right? Everybody thinks that, and we just got to get away from that thought. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Jane.
I would just kind of like to tag on to this, in that I'm a parent of 2 teen boys, and I've actually talked to them and said, you are at risk of harming each other or another child, because children, when they're teenagers, they're prepubescent and going through puberty, they have lots of questions. And I think that we owe it to those children to let them know that they are at risk of harming someone else and living with those effects. That's just what I've done as a parent.
And not realizing they might be causing harm. That's the other thing, I think.
Right, because my sibling didn't know they were causing harm until years later. And then they realized, oh, that might have been harmful.
Yeah.
And they live with it. My sibling lives with it, and it's changed their life as well.
Exactly. And I've spoken with those who caused harm, and at 13, 14 years old, they didn't fully understand the extent to which they might have known to some degree what they were doing was wrong, or whatever, because they were being secretive, etc. But a child's brain is very, very difficult for them to extrapolate that out to a life of consequences for themselves and for other people. So that little brain doesn't necessarily fully grapple what's going on. And I think we need to appreciate that as well. I think society needs to appreciate that well, particularly when we're talking about stigma, because what my experience, the work that I've been doing, there's a big brush when you hear the term sexual abuse. there's this big brush that comes out. And in that big brush, it's usually men against females, or males against females. And it's usually older people to younger people. And it's usually monster to victim, or reprobate to victim, or really deviant psychopathic behavior to victim. And what society doesn't understand necessarily is that what we have seen in, granted, limited research, is that the child causing harm is a child who doesn't fully grasp what they're doing. A majority of those people who cause harm are not predators in training. You know, they are children making really stupid, bad, selfish, narcissistic decisions that, as you say, Jane, will impact them for the rest of their lives. And I know, we all know stories of people who caused harm, who, like you say, your brother is aware that what he did cause harm and has to live with that. I'm aware of people who caused harm who killed themselves when it was about to come out that they caused harm. And they were 12 years old when they caused harm, and it was about to come out, and they killed themselves. So that's a waste. Do you know what I mean? That's a waste. And that's because in part, I think society holds this stigma that this big brush sexual abuse comes out, and it's just monster to victim. And there's no tolerance levels there at all. And that's why speaking to society and saying, hey, we're lived experience experts here. We know what we're talking about, and we can still sit here and say, this abusive behavior was absolutely unacceptable to me. It changed the trajectory of my life. I have a life of healing and work to do. And I recognize that this person over here may be on that same path too. Like, not all the time, but do you know what I mean? I'm a lived experience expert, and I don't necessarily think that my brother is some nasty predator pedophile. Do you know what I mean? So society needs to pay attention to me and all the rest of us who say the same thing. And go ahead, Maria.
And it does hit the whole spectrum too. And you've said this, but
Yes.
I just, for those on this call, I know we have friends who, you know, it has gone on, and it has, you know, perpetuated into adulthood. So it does happen. But like you said, it's still children who are starting out. And if they get treatment, and if it's disclosed early, that's when we have the best results. So that's why we need this education and awareness, so that it doesn't get to those ones who have been now tortured their, you know, even if it's emotionally tortured for the rest, decades later, still dealing with this because it never got resolved or never got addressed early on.
I hold out hope for that opportunity that society will say enough is enough, you know, and I've heard many people say this in different ways. If this subject matter was the number of children starving in the world, or the number of children who had, you know, illnesses that could be prevented or could be fixed, if it was that sort of, if that was the topic du jour, if that's what we were talking about, say, children starving in the world, because conservatively speaking, some of the numbers would suggest that 100 million children, at least around the world, are currently enduring sibling sexual abuse, based on conservative numbers around the world right now. 100 million children starving in the world right now. Would that get society pissed off enough to do anything about it, do you think? Or is the problem just too big?
I think it's too complicated to answer like that, right? Because it is very layered. I think we're talking about it in terms of, you know, there's education that needs to happen, but there's also so much layered stuff there. I think the report just came out about the rates of abuse before COVID, after COVID. And they thought that during COVID, that it was going to skyrocket. I thought the same thing. I was like, oh my God, what is going to happen to these children? And then the numbers come out and they're saying it went down. And they're saying, why does it happen? Because of resources and support. So a lot of stuff around class issues or poverty and stuff like these, a lot of things impact a lot of abuse that happens in the family. And so if they have support, you know, if there are resources and support about a whole bunch of other things, so it doesn't necessarily have to be around sexual abuse or sexual violence, but it is an intersectional issue. And I think we always want to make it very simple. It's not simple. That's why there are no monsters. There are people who do these things. And if we stay on the monster stuff, it makes it so much more digestible for us. It's about our capacity. It's so much easier to think that some monster is doing something than, you know, your neighbor or the babysitter or something, because that's when we have to talk about it and deal with our own emotions. You know, so I think it's really a very layered topic, and that's what makes it you know, very difficult to talk about, because we want, you know, we want all this change, but it takes many things, including the education, including parents understanding their power, including like, so there are a lot of things that need to happen simultaneously for, I believe, the eradication of sexual abuse.
I totally agree with that. A lot of things, you know, it's the causal points and all of these things around sibling sexual abuse is layered and complicated. I suppose my point was about the very first thing that needs to happen is a willingness to even attempt to understand that complexity and to take steps in the right direction. And I wonder, if we were talking about any other subject, if society would be willing to at least open its ears.
Mm.
But is it because we're talking
Maybe.
about sexual abuse that society goes la 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 la? You know, I don't want to
Maybe,
know,
yeah.
particularly around siblings, children.
Mm-hmm. Possibility, yeah, because it's like not a subject that people want to talk about.
No, it's not palatable.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I know that, you know, as I said earlier, I could talk to you guys for a really long time, and I think there's a richness of understanding and knowledge in this group, and also to the people who needed to leave because they had other meetings and things going on. So what I want to do as we wrap up is I'm just going to ask each one of you if you have a thought or a sort of a final message that you want to share with the audience about what you think society needs to know and do about sibling sexual abuse. So I'm just going to babble for a couple of seconds while everybody thinks about it, because somebody's going to be the first one to have to speak. I'm just going to give them a little bit of extra time here by just babbling for another second or two. And then Bryn, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Well, I think for me, what comes to mind is understanding that healing is possible, you know, as from the lens of a therapist, from somebody who's dedicated my entire adult life to healing my trauma and to helping others heal theirs, that this is something that we can all heal from. Like you're saying, people that harm, people that have been harmed, our society in general, you know, like all of that is absolutely possible. And so sometimes I think if, you know, we turn a blind eye because like, oh, there's nothing we can do, but you can contribute to healing, like Ignacio says, like through your own healing. And when you heal yourself, you can then create a safe space for other people to then speak to you about things, excuse me, and it allows others to heal. So that's really what it comes down to, is healing on so many levels as individuals all the way up to society as a whole.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Bryn. Jane.
I would hope that society would understand that this is a type of abuse that can happen in any home. It doesn't matter race, doesn't matter economics, doesn't matter the family dynamics. My mom was a school teacher, my dad was a school psychologist. Especially today with the access to pornography, it's not if your child's going to come across pornography, it's more about when. I feel like no family is immune, and I would have to agree with Bryn that there is healing, but we would like to avoid having to go through this, because I think several of us on this call, we are grieving our childhoods, and we lost our childhoods. We lost a lot of our adulthood, and I'm a parent. I want the very best for my children. So I would prefer to have avoided all of that.
Thank you, Jane. That's great. Ignacio.
I think I would want people to know that, well, ditto. I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but I would say that one way I think that anyone could connect to this issue and to really think about sibling sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, is to think about their own childhood. I don't care. It doesn't matter if you don't have to be a survivor. I guarantee that if each and every one of us really took some intentional time to think about our own upbringing, our own childhood, even think about the things that we still think about today, something that keeps popping up for you, something that hasn't been resolved for you, we all can understand the issues of our childhood that pop up for us as adults and why we keep repeating same dynamics relationally. Now throw in sexual abuse, and that can manifest throughout our entire lives. So if people could think about how their childhood was affected through relational dynamics, familial dynamics, power dynamics, not even about sex, I think that they can have a clearer understanding of how this manifestation of trauma reverberates out through our entire lives. And from there, even thinking about our childhood is healing. It's because we're going back, we're being introspective. So that healing work of looking back helps us to move forward and have a better understanding of other kinds of abuses and traumas that is happening around us.
That's great. And it's just reinforces the idea that there's empathy within everyone. If we take our own life experiences and map that in with another subject or whatever, we will have those sorts of experiences that created a degree of disruption or trauma. And if we can touch that, then I can understand somebody else's pain. I can understand somebody else's experience to a degree. Thank you for that. And Maria.
I guess ditto, ditto, ditto. And I would say don't turn a blind eye. And it's also not, and don't assume it's child's play. So don't assume it's nothing, and don't turn a blind eye when you hear of any of this, and believe the survivors who say what it was like for them. Yeah.
So I get to have the last word. So I just get to say one big fat ditto and just make my life easier. But also I want to thank each and every one of you, and also those who have dropped off the call because of other commitments that they had, that I want to acknowledge and restate to you all that lived experience matters, and people's stories matter, not only to the person telling to the story, but those who listen to the story with an open mind and an open heart. And they try and, as you were saying, Ignacio, map their experiences onto what they're being told by other people can help them to be more empathic. The subject of sibling sexual abuse is not something we need to run away from. In actual fact, it is something that people can understand and they can wrap their head around it. Because children are little beings, they're little sexual beings, and their wires get all screwed up sometimes. And there's all sorts of dynamics that contribute to sibling sexual abuse. And it is something that as a society, we can talk about, just like we learn to talk about the Catholic Church and all sorts of other things. I keep coming back to the church, but it's just one example of what society would not talk about in many of our lifetimes. This is something that when we were kids, the church wouldn't have talked about this sort of stuff, and they do now. So there is a possibility that in the near future, we will be able to have these sorts of conversations like we do other conversations that were hard. But society does have a role, and everybody listening to this conversation has a role to examine themselves and to see why it is that they hold on to their stigma, why it is that they hold on to their judgment and their shoulding on other people. And have a look at that, because if that's all you do as somebody listening to this, you're actually contributing to a more positive outcome. If you look at yourself, whether you are a person who is a survivor, a perpetrator, another family member, or not a family member at all, this is just a subject that you're learning about or you're listening into, examine yourself and ask yourself why it is that, as that society member who doesn't necessarily understand this particular subject matter firsthand, why it is you're not willing to have those conversations. So that, because that will point to what it is that you might need to work on. Anyway, I want to thank everyone again. Thank you so much for coming. And people who are listening will be able to find information about your organizations and the work that you're doing in the resources pack that they can download, or that they did download along with this video link. So thanks, everyone.